Hey, everybody, we're back again with Tom Brennan, the private investigator who's been working on the Ellen Greenberg case for a number of years now. And there have been developments, as we said in our last podcast with Tom. It's been the case is out of the hands of Josh Shapiro, the attorney general who's running for governor in Pennsylvania, out of his hands now finally, and turned over to the Chester County DA, who says she will examine the case. How far that'll get, I don't know. But what's interesting now with these new developments is Shapiro is coming out with a statement that pretty much, Tom, accuses your team of withholding information. So what's that about? First of all, what did he say and what's he referring to?
Well, but in July, okay, the AG's office, they kicked back the case to Philadelphia, stating, unfortunately, after 4 years of work, new expert testimony and information has been publicly alleged, but withheld from our investigators, and new accusations of conflict of interest have been made against our office. Okay, I want to talk just about that expert testimony and information being withheld from investigators and their office. Okay, that is a lie. That's totally untrue. They could have had access to anything they wanted. To begin with, I was only interviewed for about, I was only spoken to, not interviewed, spoken to for about 10 minutes in these 9.5 years that I've been. In the 4 years that they've had it, okay, I was spoken to by the supposedly individual who's in charge of who was in charge of the investigation, Senior Deputy Attorney General Christopher Phillips. I was only spoken to him for about 10 minutes, and that's when I turned over the first bit of case documentation to him.
So
I was never interviewed by any of their investigators, and I was never spoken to by anyone else.
Well, exactly what evidence are you withholding according to Shapiro's office?
Well, I believe what they're talking about is some of the evidence that was uncovered as a result of deposition. That being the post-mortem wounds.
The tissue sample from the back of the neck showing, according to a medical expert hired by the city itself, that it was post-mortem, meaning inflicted on Ellen Greenberg after she died, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so now they're claiming, I guess, according to the statement, that you guys were withholding this information from Shapiro's office. You're saying it's just the opposite.
No, there's no way. You know, to begin with, I don't know where they're coming up with this spin, okay? Because to begin with, if they were doing such a thorough investigation, okay, why in the world didn't they have medical professionals take a look at those specimens? That's part of a death investigation. That's part of a thorough investigation. Why should the parents of the victim, why should they be obligated to spend tens of thousands of dollars to have these individuals deposed?
Okay, Tom, let's go through the sequence of this. Now, during Shapiro's allegedly thorough investigation, the city of Philadelphia hired a neurologist to examine the wounds. She examined one wound in particular, possibly two, that were inflicted after Ellen died, after being stabbed 20 times. And this was in the back of the neck, that tissue sample. And the neurologist said that it was inflicted after Ellen died. Now, you didn't know anything about that finding until you deposed that neurologist, right? So Shapiro's office knew about the finding all this time, and they never told you about it. You had to find out for yourself, correct?
No. What had happened was they never deposed Dr. Emery, okay, the neuroforensic pathologist that performed the exam. Okay? To begin with, once we learned that there were specimens, the specimens existed in the Philadelphia medical examiner's office, Mr. Pedraza notified Dr. Galino, the medical examiner, okay, the director of the medical examiner's office. And he requested Dr. Galino have one of his staff conduct an examination of those specimens. Well, in August of 2019, okay, 2019, Dr. Galino instructed Dr. Emery to conduct an examination of those specimens.
Right.
Okay. At that time, she conducted the examination, and you know the results of her findings.
Which
Okay.
was at least one of those wounds in the back of the neck
Was
were inflicted
post-mortem.
post-mortem after Ellen died. Okay.
Yes, yeah. It was after Ellen died. It was administered after Ellen died. All right. That was in August of 2019. Dr. Emery, what we discovered as a result of deposition, was also instructed not to submit a report. So even though we had requested this examination, and Mr. Pedraza had followed up with correspondence,
What?
he sent correspondence to the medical examiner's office requesting when would the examination be done. The response that came from Dr. Galino basically said, we're extremely busy and I'm going out of town. So sometime it'll be performed sometime in the future. Well, it was done. So Dr. Galino, he wasn't even truthful when he responded in correspondence to Mr. Pedraza.
All right, so
regarding the results of the examination.
the examination had already been performed, but they were denying that it had been performed at that time.
Dr. Galino was saying, yes, they hadn't done anything with it.
Okay. So then,
so you have Dr. Emery performing the exam as she's instructed by Dr. Galino in August of 2019. You have Dr. Galino saying, oh, we're not, and Dr. Galino advising her not to submit a report, not to perform a report. Then you have Dr. Galino in correspondence to Mr. Pedraza saying, hey, we're extremely busy and I'm going out of town. So we don't know when we're going to do the exam. Okay. And it was only in November of 2021 when Dr. Emery was deposed that we learned of her examination in August of 2019.
deposed by Attorney Pedraza, who's representing
Yes.
Greenberg's family. So
Yes.
you guys did that deposition on your own. It wasn't through the cooperation of the Attorney General's office.
No, that's right. Had it not been for Mr. Pedraza in being aggressive and having these depositions completed, we would have never learned about what went on. Now,
So again,
when conducting a thorough criminal investigation, which was alleged by Mr. Shapiro's office, okay, when conducting a thorough investigation, that office has access to a grand jury. Okay, in conducting a thorough investigation, they could have subpoenaed those physicians and had them testify before the grand jury. And had they done that, okay, they would have had access to the information, okay, and the Greenberg, Dr. Greenberg and Sandy Greenberg would not have had to expend tens of thousands of dollars to have these depositions performed.
Okay, so they convened the grand jury and brought in, you said, the physicians?
Yes, Dr. Emery, Dr. Galino, Dr. Osborne.
They were all part, Osborne and Galino were the medical examiner's office, and Lindsay Emery
And
was.
Dr. Emery, at that time, she performed the exams. She too was an employee of the medical examiner's office.
Okay, so in other words, Tom, they had this information for a couple of years and didn't disclose it to you, to the Greenberg family or the lawyer, and then you found out on your own separately afterwards. So,
Yes,
so then how can you be accused of withholding that information? Wasn't
that's
it?
why I'm saying, that's why I'm saying the, you know,
If it was being withheld, it was being withheld by Shapiro's office, correct?
no, it was being held by the medical examiner's office. But what I'm saying is, if Shapiro office would have been conducting a thorough investigation, they would have been in touch with the medical examiner's office, and they would have learned that information long before we had to go through it in deposition.
Okay, that's one scenario, but do you think
Okay, that was 2019.
and
Okay, that was August of 2019. Now you're talking about, we learned about it in November of 2021.
okay, but
That's over 2 years.
okay, but Tom,
Okay, what were the investigators doing for 2 years?
what isn't it likely that Shapiro's office would have known about Lindsay Emery's conclusion about that post-mortem wound? I mean, the medical examiner works hand in hand with Shapiro on cases like this. So, is it credible that Shapiro didn't know the finding of Dr. Lindsay Emery?
Well, Deputy Senior Attorney General, Senior Deputy Attorney General Christopher Phillips, who was in charge of the investigation of conducting this thorough investigation. He had spoken, I know he spoke to, excuse me, I know he spoke with Dr. Galino and Dr. Osborne. How many times? I don't know. But did he know of this? He was in charge of the investigation. He had agents supposedly assigned into the investigation. What were he and these agents doing?
Now, Tom, let me do some just scenarios here. The fact that it's recently been turned over to Chester County out of Shapiro's hands, where he can't really control the investigation. And
Well, he had it, his office had it for 4 years.
for 4 years.
4 years, okay?
I mean, it happened 11 years ago. He had it for 4 years.
Yes,
And in those 4 years, he twice concluded it was a suicide, despite all the peculiarities about the investigation or lack thereof, or the scene of her death, et cetera, which it would appear to most people, I believe, begging for a more thorough investigation. But Shapiro said twice, nothing to see here, move along, clear-cut suicide. Now, it's so at this point now, could it be that Shapiro, who's running for governor on a crime fighter stance, among other things, could it be that Shapiro thinking that his conclusion that it was suicide might be overturned by the Chester County DA. He's already doing this to cover himself as an excuse of why this evidence wasn't examined by him, because he said he didn't know anything about it. You guys were withholding it from him.
Well, as I said at the beginning of our conversation, that statement is totally untrue. Totally untrue. Okay? They were the agency that claimed to do this thorough investigation. Okay? They conducted a thorough investigation. I've been at it for 9.5 years. Did anybody ever sit down and interview me? No. Did anybody ever ask me any questions? No. Okay? The interview that I had with individuals within his office was a meeting that I requested, and that I asked them questions about their work, okay, which they allege they did, but yet till this day, they haven't supplied me with the results of what they said they did with the forensic analysis. Okay, so when you have all of this, okay, no matter what they do, okay, there's never ever going to be enough litter in the box. They have scratched around and scratched around and scratched around, and it still stinks. And it stinks because they never got off their political butt and actually did the work. Okay? They never did the work.
Now, do you expect more roadblocks to be thrown up, even though it is out of his hands? He's already establishing, or trying to, in the media and in the public consciousness, the narrative that he didn't know about this sample that could change the conclusion, because you guys weren't giving it to him. You had that information and you held it back, and that was some kind of a trick on your part. So it's not his fault.
For he or his office to make a statement like that is ludicrous. It's ludicrous that we withheld information from them. That is so ridiculous. I can't believe they would make such a statement.
Well, now it's in the hands of the Chester County DA. Now, with this development and his statements that, it's not his fault if that sample turns out to be legitimate, that she was stabbed after her death, it's not his fault. Now, what's she going to do with this? Or is she going to even conclude that the analysis of that sample post-mortem was proper, that it was real, it was accurate? What's she going to do with it?
When we learned that information in November, at deposition, okay? When we learned that information, Mr. Pedraza gave that information to the Attorney General's office, okay? It wasn't until there were accusations made about the conflict of interest that was just done in July, okay? So you had 8 months that they specifically knew about this information and did nothing. They made one statement saying that Dr. Emery misspoke.
Right.
Now she's under oath, and she's testifying under oath, and she's responding to the questions presented by Mr. Pedraza. Okay? That's in November of 2021. And they say she misspoke. And if you take a look at when they said that, okay, it was prior to them recusing themselves because of allegations of conflict of interest.
So now the story has changed to you guys withheld it from him in case
Yes,
it
yes.
is found to be an
They
accurate.
go from Dr. Emery misspeaking to us not providing them information. I mean, you talk about CYA. I mean, it's so damn blatant that you know how stupid do they think the public is?
They're hoping. But all right, so Tom, do you think this piece of evidence alone, that at least one of the wounds, one in the back of her neck, was inflicted after she died post-mortem? If the Chester County DA, in whose hands the case is now, if she declares that that conclusion is accurate, is legitimate, should that be enough to overturn the finding of suicide?
That in itself should be. There's also another very important piece that they were told about, okay? The other important piece is that there were two knives involved. The serrated knife that was found in the victim's chest and a smooth bladed knife that made some of the wounds in the back of the neck. Okay? So why those two things in itself are are are, are overwhelming evidence that some things, you know, that this is not a suicide.
Well, Tom,
And they can't say that they didn't know that there's expert testimony regarding two knives being used to inflict the wounds on this victim.
now, Tom, are you sure you guys didn't withhold that information as well from Mr. Shapiro, the Attorney General?
I know that there was a meeting where two representatives from his office were given that information, okay, by a law enforcement entity, by another law enforcement entity, okay? I know that took place. So for them to say that information like that was held, that's a flat out lie.
And I know there's much more that's not doesn't add up, Tom. Yeah, we go on and on. We covered a lot of that in our.
I have a list. I have a list of the points that we have uncovered in the course of our investigation, and every bit of that information was provided to the Attorney General's office. So for them to say that the doctor misspoke, and for them to say that they weren't given the information, is totally untrue.
All right. Well, I'm anxiously awaiting the next chapter in this ongoing saga and the ongoing resistance, which I think is obvious to anybody. This isn't an editorial comment, but the obvious resistance that we've seen for 4 years from the Attorney General's office, from Josh Shapiro, who's running on a record now of being a hard crime fighter, truth and justice, as he runs for governor. So we'll see how soon the next chapter unfolds on this. Tom Brennan, thanks once again for being with us, and we'll be talking with you much more as the Ellen Greenberg case is now in the hands of another official, the DA of Chester County, and we will anxiously wait to see what she does with this case.
He's been, for 4 years, Josh and Sandy Greenberg have been waiting for him to meet with them and talk with them. Josh and Sandy Greenberg themselves have requested meetings with him and have not been provided them.
So the parents of Ellen Greenberg have never been interviewed by the Attorney General's office.
No.
Another incredible fact. All right, Tom, we'll be talking again. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you.